All right. Now, this is where we started years ago, and we still do. Tomorrow, when I preach, I will bring this up to the church. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. The Bible says to test everything, to prove all things, only keep those things which are true. Interesting theme for a scientist or a weather checker. Okay, nearby my house, a new motorway went in, and look what they found alongside the river. By the way, it's bumped up the value of my property from a couple of $100 an acre. I won't tell you what it is now. It keeps changing because the dollar's dropping, etc. But as they put this road in, they found crocodile fossils. Now, the important part, over at Geebung, you'll find crocodile bones in the material they had to dig out along the riverbank. Now, there's roughly where Geebung is, Aboriginal name, of course, and there's the same sort of crocodile deposits up on the Darling Downs, 120, 130 kilometres inland, much more elevated. But if you know the right places to go, you'll find crocodile remains everywhere between the Darling Downs and the coast. The interesting part about that, there's a crocodile. We've got plenty of them in Australia. They like it being warm. Their eggs, the sex of the eggs is determined by the climate. So they can't sort of afford too much cold or too much heat. They will die out. See that line at the top? That's roughly a bit north of Bundaberg. And the crocodiles become a problem, both for fishing. Yes, I've caught crocodiles on the end of the line, and there's no way you're going to reel them in. They are just so powerful. A flick of the tail and your line and sinker, etc., goes with them. But you see the bottom line? That's the lowest case we find of where the fossil crocs are. Now, there's plenty of evidence that the climate which suits crocodiles has actually changed. But there's also evidence that when you look at the fossil bones, they are at sea level today. When you look at the fossil teeth, they're also higher up. Okay, so how could you have crocodiles on a high place when you are having crocodiles in the sea only north of that line? Okay, you need to think carefully, how much can the sea level change using fossil evidence? Because the fossil evidence would imply much of Australia has been underwater not all that long ago. So when the first settlers came, all that inland area, they said there has to have been a big sea here. Perhaps it's still left here. Well, there isn't one today. So both climate change and sea level change have actually affected places like my house. Right, there's where I live. In fact, when you have a look, the fossil evidence you can collect, now fossil evidence is real evidence, it's still in the rocks. Now, this is not just my conclusion, because when I was a student and when it wasn't a climate change, you have to believe in it or else you're kicked out of the university, that was the statement that they were telling us all. The fossil evidence, the crocs up on the Darling Downs, the crocs around Brisbane, the crocs in those days had been found at Oxley. They hadn't dug the motorway then yet. They showed the Eastern Australian climate has changed at least 3 times. Now, if you're going to have fossil crocs from 20 million, 30 million, 50 million theoretical years, then you've got to admit there were no people here making industry. They were not able to change the sea level. Their heating had nothing to do with climate change at all. Now, I've been all over the world since then, up and down the west coast of America, up and down the west coast of England. In fact, we even learned at university, hey, the west coast is rising up. This is in England. And Joseph and I have traveled extensively, and that's certainly a case. Okay, then in Australia, you find it on a big scale. Okay, let's have a quick look. There's the nullarbor. Okay, nullarbor. No, that's not an Aboriginal word. It's a Latin word, null arbor. Can you guess what it might be? How many trees can you see there? Null arbor. Okay, there's a report, and you can read this, Diane, on our website. You can see all of this if you want to check it up. Here a report on a diverse and exceptionally well-preserved Middle Pleistocene. So not 200 million, not even 100 million. This is the last real part, the Ice Age sort of stuff you find in the Northern Hemisphere. Pleistocene vertebrate assemblages from caves beneath the arid treeless Nullarbor Plain of South Central Australia. Now, I've got to agree with this because I've actually jumped into these caves. Yes, if you want to see the evidence of that, have a look at one of our DVDs on Darwin on the Rocks. You will see me bravely jumping into the cave. I mean, it was spectacular, but at the bottom, it was even more spectacular. There were heaps of fossils from creatures who'd either retreated to the caves or they got into the caves accidentally, then they died and dried. But look, this report says there are immense creatures, such as wombat-like rhinoceros-sized marsupials, 7-meter-long lizards, and carnivorous lions that lived in trees. Well, there's their skeleton. Now, I've got to be honest, I found one of these. It's sitting out in my back shed now, not yet prepped because there's so much preparation involved. We found it up on the Darling Downs, but you find them down in the caves on the Nullarbor as well. There's the picture from one of the big tourist attractions down there. They used to have, well, see the greenie? They used to have green plants and giant tree-dwelling marsupial lions. Look at those teeth. Man, the tooth we found in the Darling Downs, the jaw, the skull is impressive. And there's their conclusion. Giant tree-climbing carnivores needed big trees and an abundance of plant eaters to eat. Wow. They also found that. Tasmanian tigers. Now, Tasmanian tigers have been extinct for a long time, but that was one of my first research reports. Find a fossil. I found one of them, just a fragment of it, on the Darling Downs. So perhaps we should call them Australian tigers, and the ones in Tasmania that lived into the last century, remnant tigers. They found giant kangaroos, giant wombats, and giant goannas, and tree kangaroos. Now, have you heard me emphasize trees a few times? Because we asked you, what does Nullarbor mean? Well, Nullarbor is a word that means no trees. There's hardly any plants out there. It's dry. You can access caves which show that there are animals in there that used to live on trees, in trees, on vegetation. Now, how would you end up with a null arbor plain that could support trees and animals that would make it essentially a forest? I mean, look at it. It's barren. Look at the sign, Nullarbor Plain, the eastern end. By the time you get to the other end, you know, no arbor trees. There are no trees there. In fact, if you want a boring drive. In fact, they build corners into this essentially straight road just to wake you up every now and then. And if you don't wake up, you drive into the sand in the desert and slow yourself down. Now, from space, great pictures. There's the Nullarbor Plain. In fact, there it is. In fact, what you find is when you get into it, it wasn't caused by humans. There's no evidence the Aborigines caused this because of their policies of burning off grass so they could throw boomerangs and spears. There's the western end. Flat as. I mean, big as too. This is not just the distance across Scotland. This is Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales, really. We didn't do it. Man didn't do it. But there's what you find when you look in from the coast. Yes, I've traveled all along here. And yes, I have an invitation to an Aboriginal conference out in one of the big mining towns later this year. And that's the view on the coast. There it is when you get to one of the volcanoes on the east. See the ground at the bottom, the white ground? That's what's underneath just the whole system of the Nullarbor. In fact, that's limestone. And when you have a look at this volcanic stuff on top, there's a red coating. And then you can take students, there we are, on one of our field trips. Now, can I encourage you in England, join up to Joe's field trips. If he ends up over in Tennessee in the middle part of the year, sign up with Glenn and Ruby, who are great fossil collectors. Even though Glenn's got fake knees, he does a reason. And you can go out fossil collecting in the middle Tennessee because that's your summer period. Just watch out for the ticks and all of those sort of things that can give you nasty diseases over there. But when we find beautiful fossils preserved in this limestone, these are sea creatures, scallops, pecten shells. There's no doubt about it. This whole area used to be under the ocean. Look, I mean, and we're just photographing one section of it. I'll tell you what, This is an enormous evidence. Well, actually, is it sea level change or is it the land that's risen up? You see, when you find beaches above the sea level, and we'll show you some more in a moment, you are always going to see people, oh, the sea level has changed. Well, actually, there's two possible causes. One is the sea could have dropped, but the other evidence is the land could have risen. Whether it was slow or fast, you don't know by the data we've given you, but there is definitely a sea level change here. In fact, if you want to see more of it, here we are in Victoria. Right across, you find this same bed from end to end. Now we're on the bottom end of Port Phillip Bay. And you know what's been discovered? Down here, further out to sea and round the corner, there are old Aboriginal campsites under the water. Now, when you get up close, there's some of my grandchildren there coming on a field trip with Grandpa. And can you see the black mud at the top on the red layer there, merging into the white? Well, there's the evidence this was under the water, all right, and not all that long ago. These shells are not degraded muchly. They are part of a mud deposit. They're not washed in. This is just the regular sort of shells you find on the bottom of a sea. It's you could call it a shell bed for sure, but it goes forever and forever and forever. And underneath it is the same limestone you find across at Mount Gambier in South Australia that you find for ages. There's no doubt about it. Sea levels have changed. Okay, now don't forget, we've raised one point you need to know. Did the sea level change because the sea dropped, or did the sea level change because the land rose? Now, in my experience, the evidence favors the land rising or the land sinking. In fact, we're going to actually mention a couple of things here that touch on both. Now, I'll give you the bottom line because it was given to me at Queensland University. We're not going to discuss any reference to catastrophic nonsense like Noah's flood. Bottom rule in science, whether it's Tim Flannery, whether it's the current climate change greenies, you will not deal with the actual written evidence that predates even science. Genesis chapter 6, God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and I will destroy them with the earth. And you read about rain, you read about flood. Now, when you look at the biblical description, number one, the water rose up and covered all the surface of the earth. So you basically have proof, textual comment that there was a massive flood. And it definitely is a flood that covered the whole earth. But at the same time, when you think this through, Noah's flood, well, there was waters coming from below for another 110 years after the rain stopped. So the rain just didn't come from the top to make raindrops for the first time, like in our foot fossil. The actual rain that fell down was supplemented for at least another 110 days by the water coming out from the inside. Now, where did it get there? Well, God put it there on the second day of creation. And the third day, when the land rose up, all the water on the outside ran inside except for one patch. You realize the Bible talks both about the land having to sink so the water could come out, and then at the end of the flood, the land sank back down. So you're going to end up with two lots of information here. Here's a couple of conclusions before we actually take a question break here. Just briefly, my observations is those who are climate worshippers, and that's what I call them. They believe that we are in charge, like Tim Flannery. We're evolving into a mono-organism. And if you didn't get Craig's implication, any ant who doesn't do its share is put to death. Any human ant, that is, because you have to be excluded from the system. So don't be surprised governments are trying to minimize land ownership, minimize your control, so the organism can actually exercise control courtesy of your tax money. In fact, they'll make sure you don't get any and make all your spending digital. Climate worshippers usually want things to stay the same because their security is only in this earth. Can I make a key spiritual point before we go to our first question time? Make sure your security is in Christ and not in the things of this world, because if Noah worship the climate, and God came along and said, "Hey, Noah, I'm going to whip the climate to pieces. I'm going to use it to judge the world." Well, the Bible talks about a God who's done this several times, both with heat, fog, insects, you name it. Can I encourage you, if you're not a Christian yet, make sure you don't trust in the climate, because your accuracy, well, where's our 100 mils of rain this morning overnight? It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened Jurassic Ark, and we really do need the rain.